The contention and argument for our collective PowerPoint presentation and Assignment 3 is regarding the issue of the current status of the minimum age of criminal responsibility within Australia. As you will see in our presentation, Australia's current age of 10 years does not conform with the United Nations advice, nor the majority of countries worldwide. We believe that this low age of 10 is particularly detrimental to disadvantaged and vulnerable youth, and is not in step with the current and ongoing social climate of the world in which we live. Our contention and argument is strongly supported by peer-reviewed research. The following presentation will briefly outline a number of factors that contribute to our contention and argument. These factors include the current legal issues which surround the minimum age of criminal responsibility. An acronym of MACR will be used throughout the presentation. We will also address how the brain development of a child of 10 does not align with the common law principle of mens rea, nor the presumption of dolly incapax. We will introduce the issues regarding discrimination, with particular attention given to Australia's Indigenous youth. The factors that contribute to their vulnerability and disadvantage will be highlighted. United Nations recommendations will be discussed, accompanied by a graph displaying clear statistics and revealing how out of step Australia is on a global scale with regard to the MACR. Lastly, we will provide recommendations as to how and why the minimum age of criminal responsibility can and must be raised within Australia.
At 10 years of age, Australia has one of the lowest age of criminal responsibility of the Western world, and in recent years has faced criticism both locally and internationally for their treatment of children in conflict with the law, citing growing evidence that shows children aged 14 years and under are not mature enough to be considered criminally responsible and have limited ability to advocate for themselves before the courts. Section 4N of the Crimes Act provides that a child aged between 10 and 14 years can only be held responsible for an act if the child knows that his or her conduct was wrong. This means that any child aged 10 through the 14 years can be arrested, strip searched and imprisoned by police for an alleged crime and dealt with the full extent of the law. It is then up to the prosecution to rebut the presumption of dolly incapax. This doctrine will be discussed further in the presentation. However, there are growing concerns that these legal safeguards fail to adequately protect the vulnerable and disadvantaged children. Furthermore, there is mounting recognition that correctional facilities are crimiogenic and that children that are encountering the justice system at an early age are already some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged and better suited to diversional programs. Mens rea is a common law principle meaning of evil intent, and it reflects from the ideal that it is generally neither fair nor useful to subject people to criminal punishment for unintended actions or unforeseen circumstances. Contemporary research shows that a child's brain does not fully develop until well into their 20s, and they lack the ability to fully understand the consequences of their actions. Children's brains work differently to adults when making decisions or problem solving, and their actions are guided more by emotions and reactions and less by logical thought. Further to this, research on brain development shows that 10-year-olds have not developed the required level of maturity to form the necessary intent for criminal responsibility that mens rea principle requires. Juvenile offenders often have more complex needs than adult offenders. Mental illness is one of the biggest causes for concern among juveniles in detention, with up to 88% of young people in custody displaying symptoms of mild to severe psychiatric disorders, and many of these problems are compounded by juvenile psychosocial immaturity.
Regarding the presumption of dolly incapax, it is argued that children under the age of 14 years old cannot, under common law, mentally comprehend the gravity of criminal conduct. Therefore, they cannot be held accountable for criminal conduct. Their lack of maturity and emotional intelligence in understanding the extent of their actions deem their comprehension of criminal behaviour severely compromised. This presumption is rebuttable, meaning that the prosecution can prove that a child under the age of 14 committed a crime, if they can provide evidence that that child knew or understood that their behaviour was in fact criminal, rather than just naughty or mischievous. As such, dolly incapax is currently not being adhered to within Australia due to the easy ability of the prosecution to prove that the child understood what they were doing to be wrong, often whereby it becomes the child and defence's obligation to prove the child's innocence, rather than the onus on the prosecution to prove the child's guilt. Thus, Dolly Incopax does not protect children anymore. The presumption of Dolly Incopax should play a key role in diverting young offenders aged 10 to 13 years old from the criminal justice system and imprisonment, whereby there are currently inconsistencies in the use of the presumption, when it should be used equally, attempting to divert all offenders aged 10 to 13 years old. The crackdown of crime involving harsher and more punitive sentences disproportionately impacts Indigenous children, who are then far more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system in comparison to non-Indigenous children. It is outlined that harsher sentences and a tough-on-crime approach does more harm than good, whereby once youth enter the criminal justice system, they are immediately more likely to live a life of crime. As such, diversionary programs that target behavioural issues and the causes of offending, like unstable living conditions and poverty, will more so result in reduced rates of recidivism. As this continues, it becomes more evident that the criminal justice system has not learned its lesson from the terrible and inhumane acts that occurred at Don Dale, which was highlighted within the Four Corners episode, whereby to protect young children, the Royal Commission into Juvenile Detention Centres within the Northern Territory indicated the need to raise the age of criminal responsibility within Australia to 14 years old, and only to 12 years old for serious indictable offences, yet we have still not raised the age. To be truly tough on crime, there should be greater diversionary tactics and assistance to Indigenous youth who are disadvantaged to reduce recidivism. This is outlined within LAW 2020. It is indicated that the current tough on crime tactics are only tough on children, and they enforce a cycle of crime impossible for these Indigenous children to escape.
Children that are being imprisoned are the most vulnerable within our community. Approximately 600 Australian children under the age of 14 are detained, with underprivileged Indigenous youths accounting for 40 to 50% of those incarcerated. Compared to only 50% of non-Indigenous children, approximately 80% of Indigenous children who come before the Australian Children's Courts have a criminal record. Indigenous youths are more likely to have their bail denied and be remanded to custody rather than receiving police diversionary privileges or court diversion. Most youths who come in contact with the criminal justice system are disadvantaged in every way. They are more likely to have experienced family violence, have mental health issues, lower levels of IQ, lower levels of education, lack of stable housing, and have lived with non-pro-social living environments. As such, they are disadvantaged youths who need to be protected. The criminal justice system has failed Indigenous individuals by prioritizing punishment and imprisonment instead of culturally appropriate approaches and assistance. Australia does not follow the UN guidelines in this regard, and our country's age of criminal responsibility is significantly lower than the global average, despite the fact that other nations have substantially higher ages of criminal responsibility and lower rates of juvenile crime, demonstrating the potential benefits of raising the age. Given this, the UN Committee recommended that the minimum age of criminal responsibility be set at 12. But also urged countries to continue raising it to a higher age level. According to the SBS News graphic below, Australian legislation permits criminal charges to be brought against children as young as 10, which is younger than the global minimum age of criminal responsibility average of 12 years. According to reports, youths between the ages of 10 and 17 made up 13% of all offenders in Australia in 2015 to 2016. Looking at the United States of America, 35 states do not have a minimum age of criminal responsibility, with the remaining states having a minimum age range between 6 to 10 years, according to a report by the Center of Juvenile and Criminal Justice. Furthermore, the minimum age of criminal responsibility in Scandinavian nations such as Norway, Sweden, and Finland is set at 15 years, and the minimum age of criminal responsibility in Brazil, Luxembourg, Peru, and Uruguay stands at 18, exceeding the UN's policy on children's responsibility.
Our conclusions and subsequent recommendations are as follows. Affording children who come into contact with the criminal justice system the presumption of Dolly Incopax, unless evidentially proven otherwise. Secondly, scientific research has proven that the mental capacity of children does not align with mens rea, and therefore the onus to prove one's innocence should not be placed on the child, but rather uphold the burden of proof, meaning that the prosecution must prove the child's guilt beyond reasonable doubt within criminal cases. Thirdly, raising the age of criminal responsibility would have a positive effect in decreasing the numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are currently overrepresented within detention. And lastly, raising the age will give children the chance to develop, understand consequence, and lessen their chances of coming into contact with the criminal justice system.